All right, welcome everyone. This is our second to last session of this year's Implementation Science Reading course. And I am absolutely thrilled to get to introduce Dr. Renat Bedas, who's going to come and speak with us today about how to fund your implementation science research and practice. We're also going to have some brief presentations from Dennis Lee, from Dr. Dennis Lee, sorry about that, Dennis, and also from Dr. Kelly Scott to talk about some of the opportunities for funding internal to Northwestern. There's lots of them, so we really look forward to sharing them all with you. So whenever you're ready, Renat, go ahead and take us away.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Let me get the slides to work. And for those of you all who feel comfortable leaving your video on, I do actually love to see your faces while I present. So I know that I haven't lost the connection or I'm talking into the abyss. So thank you for that. I'm really excited to be here with this group today talking about grant writing, which is one of my favorite topics. Now, I recognize it might not be everyone's favorite topic, but I'll try to make it as engaging and interesting as possible. And I really want to encourage you all to use ample usage of the chat. If there's anything that I say that doesn't make sense or that you want to follow up on, we're going to hold the questions till the end, as Miranda noted. But I find that if you ask the questions as soon as they come up, you remember them. So please do use the chat. I also just want to note that the material that I'll be sharing today, I learned myself from the Implementation Research Institute and TITRE, which are both NIH-funded capacity building institutes that I participated in way back when. And most of the things I learned then still hold about grant writing. And so there's a lot of oldie but goodie information in here that I wanted to share with you all. So in the 30 minutes that I'll be speaking, I hope to share a little bit with you about the existing funding opportunities. And I do want to note, I really am going to emphasize NIH related funding because it has its own particular nuances, and we could do a different session on other types of funding, but that is really what I have the most experience with and what I'll be talking about. Also want to share a little bit about what NIH has funded to date, because I think it helps us understand what they might be interested in funding in the future, and share some competencies in dissemination and implementation science grant writing. So these are the things that I hope to accomplish today. But before I jump into all the didactic content related to grant writing, I do want to kind of get a flavor for the audience. If we were in the room together, I'd do some hand raising, but we're not. So I want you all to free associate in the chat. So when you hear the terms grant writing, are you this kiddo on the left who's like terrified in the spelling bee, or are you this kiddo on the right who's really excited, or somewhere in the middle? So maybe just share some of the words that come to mind when you think about, okay, I'm going to be writing a grant next month. Go. What are the feels that you have? Fear, mostly excited, in between, necessary, excited but daunting, time consuming. Yes, this is going to take a while. Overwhelming, tedious, where's the time going? Excited but tired, truth. All right, I appreciate that a lot of people are bringing out the dualities of grant writing, which is that it is awesome, but also can feel overwhelming, time consuming, tiring, exhausting. And I'd like to ask now another let's chat moment. Can folks share what kinds of mechanisms they've applied to previously? So I have a sense of kind of people's general grant writing experience. So maybe you've written a K, maybe you've written a small R, maybe you've written a foundation grant or internal pilot funding. Maybe you've never written a grant. Just share in the chat again. Okay, so we've got Fs. Oh, this is going fast now. Lots of experience here with folks who have had NIH funding, a range of types. Some Ks, some pre-doctoral, foundation, philanthropy, Klingenstein, some assistance on small Rs. Nice. Any other mechanisms that folks have applied for? Looks like a ranging from internal, philanthropy, foundation, NIH. So you don't have to volunteer yourself, but if there's anyone who hasn't written a grant, that's okay. There's always a first time. And believe it or not, we are not born from the womb knowing how to write grants, and it's very much kind of learned skill. And I like to think about it kind of like writing a puzzle, putting all the pieces together. And I think it can be fun because it's really dedicated time to think about a research question that you're excited about, but it can also definitely be tricky. And thank you to Diara for sharing that. That was brave. And we all started there. So that's the exciting part. So I want to tell you a little bit about what is available from NIH in terms of funding in this space. So just to give you a brief history, 2005 was the first year that NIH put out a set of program announcements explicitly focused on dissemination and implementation science. So that's really the starting point. In the beginning, they only reviewed grants every other cycle. So for those of you who are new to the NIH funding world, there are 3 cycles a year that are fairly standard. And then there's RFAs, requests for applications, that sometimes are in different cycles, but the general cycles are 3 times a year. In the beginning, there weren't a lot of grants, so they reviewed them every other cycle, and now there are a lot, and they are coming in hot and heavy, which is really exciting. And there's now a standing scientific review group called SIHH that is participated in by more than 17 of the institutes. So that's really exciting. And it's this program announcement, it's called Dissemination, Implementation, Research, and Health, has been issued 5 times since that first issuance in 6 times in 2005. So 2022 is the last time they issued it. And every time they issue it, they add a little bit more about what the field needs and what direction they'd like to see funding applications go in. SIHH is led by the scientific review officer, Dr. Wang. SIHH stands for Science of Implementation in Health and Healthcare. And if you go to the website, you can actually see language about the grants that SIHH reviews. And it's really deeply focused on implementation science and advancing the methods and the field of implementation science. So I'll say a little bit more about that, but I think you all learned about hybrid grants probably over the course of this reading course. And SIHH strives to really review the type 2 and 3s, not the type 1s, which are more about testing the thing and learning something about implementation versus testing the strategies that we do to help people do the thing. So I definitely recommend that you check out this website. So if you go to the program announcement, which was just reissued in 2022, and you'll see the link, and I'll make these slides available, you'll see that there's 3 grant mechanisms supported by this program announcement. R01s, which are kind of the big kahuna grants, R21s, which are more high risk, high reward, slightly smaller budgets than the R01s, and then R03s, which are smaller Rs. And so you can write any one of those 3 mechanisms. And I know some of you all haven't written NIH grants before based on what you responded in the chat. So if you have questions about the types of mechanisms, feel free to add them in the chat and we can answer them in the Q&A. But those are really the 3 types that this study section reviews. And it's really focused on identifying, developing, or testing strategies. So not the thing, but the strategies that we do to help people do the thing. There's a real emphasis in this reissuance on equity and the intersection between health equity and implementation science, as well as de-implementation. So that's kind of a newer focus for NIH. And methods and measurement in the field, which is a place where I think Northwestern is uniquely situated to lead. Well, I think we can lead in all these areas, but given the strong emphasis we have in measurement. And then in 2022, they added this last sentence about re-implementation of evidence-based health services that might have dropped off during COVID. So again, you want to go to that website and read it very closely to understand the types of questions that are funded. And the other thing you can do is you can go into NIH Reporter, which is this handy mechanism where you can search for grants that have been funded. in particular areas or using keywords. And that will allow you to see what grants have been funded that might be similar to your interests. So you can get a sense of A, making sure that you're not proposing something that's already funded, and B, that you're looking at what's been previously funded, because that's a good indicator of what might get funded in the future. Now, there's tons of RFAs that have been coming out recently that are more about a particular clinical content area. There's still an interest in advancing the science of implementation. But the key distinguishing feature here in this SIHH study section is that they're not just interested in you answering questions about your implementation of your thing, but creating generalizable knowledge for the field of implementation science. But that might not be true for RFAs that are within specific disease content areas, where there's a real need and interest to understand how better to implement that particular thing in that particular setting. And so RFAs are coming out all the time. Northwestern puts together a great summary each week of the RFAs that are relevant. And you can take a look there and you'll see almost every week there's something about implementation in there that's separate of SIHH. We have a new institute, ARPA-H, which is really focused on innovation and healthcare delivery. And so I'm watching to see what kinds of RFAs they're going to be putting out, because I think that it's going to be really relevant to the work that we all do. And then other funding in agencies like the Department of Defense, PCORI, CDC, Institute for Educational Sciences are adding grants opportunities with an implementation focus. And so, there's a lot of opportunities right now and interest in enhancing almost all work across the translational spectrum with an implementation science lens. I just want to remind you that when you do this kind of work and when you write implementation science grants, it is very team science focused. Because there's not one person that's going to have all the expertise needed to do this kind of large scale, multi-level implementation research. And so this is in the program announcement. Applicants are encouraged to form transdisciplinary teams of scientists and stakeholders or constituents. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind as you're constituting the teams for the grants that you're putting in. So I'm going to fly through this section because I really want to emphasize the competencies. So I'm not going to talk about everything that you see on each slide. It's more a resource for you, but I'm just going to stay super high level and highlight two papers that describe some of the funding that's been provided to date for these kinds of studies. This is an old paper, but it has not yet been repeated. I don't know if NIH is working on that now, or if that's something maybe somebody in this group wants to take on. But this covers dissemination and implementation research funded by NIH through the SIHH study section, but it used to be called DIRH, so it's a little bit confusing, from 2005 to 2012. In that period, 76 grants were awarded. And that is not including those RFA specific grants that might have an implementation focus. This is just exclusively grants that were funded by that standing study section that came together in 2005 after the first program announcement was announced, and totaling 80 million. And they were primarily R01s, so the big grants that have the $500,000 a year indirect cost budget or above. So what you can see here is NCI and NIMH funded the majority of those grants. Interesting to think about how the landscape might shift and what this might look like today. NCI would have a strong foothold. NHLBI, I think, would have a bigger share of the pie. And I think also NIDA potentially would look a little bit bigger now. But some of these are trends based on which of the institutes have their own centers focused on growing implementation science within each institute, but they also work across. Interesting to look at where principal investigators come from who apply for these grants. So if you look at this, primarily schools of medicine and schools of public health. And this just gives you a flavor for the types of projects that were funded in this early period of the initial DIRH funding. So a lot in cancer control and screening, smoking cessation, substance use, mental health services, depression, HIV. And obviously, there's been a huge increase in emphasis on HIV and implementation science with the ending the HIV epidemic work that Northwestern has been a real leader in. So again, I think this would look different, but it's helpful to have a historical sense. As well as the types of frameworks that were used. So I'm assuming you all have had a survey of the various frameworks, theories, and models that we use in the field. These are, it's interesting when you look at this because some of the key ones that we talk about all the time are not represented in here because this is an older paper. Does anyone want to give a hypothesis on which theories or models might be more emphasized if we had a redo of this paper from the last 10 years of implementation science funding? Thank you, Sarah and Carol. Yes, CFR would probably be prominently featured. But, there's lots like the Proctor implementation outcomes. REAIM is well represented here. And now with the REAIM extension and focus on sustainability and equity, I think it might even grow. But again, this kind of tour of the past helps us understand what the future might look like. Interestingly, even from the very beginning, a very multi-level focus, meaning that the studies were using strategies that tapped into different levels of barriers. So there was a more recent paper done by the National Cancer Institute group on the funded studies from NCI exclusively. And this is a great paper, so I definitely recommend that you take a look at it. In this paper, they cover a span from 2006 to 2019, which is certainly more recent, of about 71 grants that they funded themselves. And again, I'm not going to go through this line by line. For those of you all who are cancer researchers, I would look really closely at this to see where there are gaps and there are areas where you might be able to advance both your content area and your science. One of the interesting things that the Tinkle paper, which was the first paper I reviewed, didn't cover was whether or not there was work focused on implementation and equity in the grants that were funded. And that's something NCI has been a real leader in. So they have a table 3, which notes that 61% of the grants had a health equity component to it. And I just want to make a note, and I'm sure you all have talked about this at length in this course, which is that implementation science must explicitly attend to health equity in its investigations, even if the primary focus is not to close an inequity, because otherwise we are at risk for creating or reifying existing inequities. So I really like that NCI was explicit about looking at that across the studies that they funded. Here's some more characteristics I'll just call out. In the first column of the theories, models, and frameworks, we do see CFR. So Sarah and Carol, you were right there, as well as some other newer frameworks that weren't represented in that old paper, as well as the types of strategies that were used and what phases of implementation they map onto. So now that I've kind of done a very fast whirlwind of what NIH has funded, and I recognize I usually have an hour for this lecture, so I go way deeper, but I want to get to the competencies because that's the meat of this and what's most important. I'm going to just give you a high level sense of what you might want to focus on as you write dissemination and implementation science grants. So I usually say if you read only one paper, I would recommend that you read this paper from 2012 by Enola Proctor and colleagues. Even though it's an old paper, it still has kind of the core foundational information that you need when you think about putting together these grants. But I also want to share 2 others in case you're feeling like you have time that are helpful. One that's in the Clinical and Translational Sciences Journal, and then one that actually operationalizes an approach to kind of going through a D&I grant and seeing if it's hitting the criteria that were initially laid out by the Proctor paper. And that's by Erica Crable and colleagues. And Erica was just here through a CEDIS MSS co-sponsored talk earlier this year. And I hope many of you had the chance to see her talk because it was fantastic. But if not, I'm sure it was recorded. So I'm going to walk you through this Proctor paper because it's so important. And so hopefully maybe you don't need to read that one and then you'll have time to read the other 2 unless you've already reviewed it. So the first questions that you always want to be thinking about, and this is true for any grant, is what I want to ask a significant and critical research question, because that's the bar that is going to be placed when reviewers are evaluating your study. And that's specific to all grants, not generally. This isn't a D&I thing. But what you might want to think about that our general considerations that are D&I specific is one, if it's going to SIHH, you really want to be able to say that this is going to advance the field of implementation science writ large. And you should have a statement about that in your specific aims in the closing paragraph, as well as in the either significance or approach section of your grant. An additional thing to consider, which not all institutes are requiring, but some do, like NIMH requires that you have a mechanistic approach to the work that you're doing, and other institutes like it but don't require it, is does this move us beyond just understanding or documenting bearers and facilitators towards a more mechanistic understanding of how our implementation strategies work? And so that's a really important thing that you can infuse into your work to make sure that you're really advancing the field, because that's really where the field is at this point. We really need a deeper mechanistic understanding of our strategies. So there's a table in the Proctor paper, and the University of Washington group, their implementation science group led by Brian Weiner, have taken a lot of the visuals that from some of the seminal papers and reworked them to be more visually appetizing. So I borrowed this from the University of Washington website, but this is explicitly taken from that Proctor paper. And actually, this source is a really good one if you want to hop onto their site and see additional resources for grant funding and implementation science. And I'm going to walk you through each of these proposal ingredients, so I'm not going to go through it now. So the first ingredient that you want to make sure that you highlight is the care gap. So you want to be able to make the case that there's clear evidence for the gap between what we know we should be doing and what we're doing, and that there's room for improvement. So if you have a thing or an evidence-based practice that like 80 or 85% of people are doing, it might be hard to say we should spend millions of dollars to try to get it up just a little bit higher. And it depends on what the problem is, et cetera. And maybe there's heterogeneity and there are places where we do a really bad job with it, and you could make the case that way. But you do want to make clear that there's room for improvement. I'm sorry, I meant to change all references to stakeholders to constituents, which is the preferred language. You want constituents to be able to attest to the care gap in the letters of support, and your preliminary studies to show that that gap exists. Second, the thing that you want to be implementing, you want to demonstrate that that thing is ready for implementation. Now, there are field-specific criteria. So some fields, it's very difficult to do large-scale RCTs, and there's other types of criteria that are used to justify that practice change is needed. In the case of mental health, we like to see 2 randomized controlled trials done by 2 separate teams. That's what we call the Chambliss criteria. But you basically need to be able to justify that the thing is ready for implementation, and that we should be spending our efforts on implementing the thing. Now, with the increasing use of hybrid trials, there's an opportunity to infuse implementation science earlier and earlier. In fact, I think we should be having implementation scientists on teams with basic scientists, because the earlier we have that perspective infused, the more likely we are to design for something that will actually be implementable. However, if you're going to SIHH, that study section I was talking about earlier, you need to make the case the thing is ready for implementation. I think this is like really basic at this point. You have to have a D&I framework theory or model in your grants, and you have to make sure it's woven throughout. So it's not just that you mention that you're using CFR in the aims, but you never return to it. You need to use that model to portray the key variables and the relationships that you're testing and the measures that you're using. So it really has to be infused throughout all of those aspects. And that's really, really important. In an old study, less than 25% of the studies use theory. That would be very different now. However, I have seen heterogeneity in how people use frameworks, theories, and models, and you just really want to make sure that you're infusing it deeply. And we often use more than one, always, I would say, more than one model in our implementation science related work. Usually a determinants model and an outcomes model, and sometimes even a specific behavior change model or theory within that. So that's okay. You don't need to be constrained. Next, you need to ensure that you are really demonstrating that the work that you're doing aligns with constituent priorities and engagement. So first, you need to determine who are your constituents and who might be impacted by the implementation of your thing. So you want to show that you've had that thought process. And then you want to show that they're already engaged and that it's not a situation where you think this is a good idea, but the people who are actually going to be impacted haven't weighed in. You can use your preliminary study section to show which constituents you've already engaged, and you can even do preference elicitation work with them to provide data on their preferences in that preliminary study section. And it's good for you to always at baseline have a letter of support. It's the minimal reflection of investment here, but even better, you really want to leverage those important community partnered research principles. And if you can demonstrate that you have a long partnership and your partners are investigators and authors on your publications, that really goes a long way in line with all the principles that we've all learned from the Center for Community Health. Next, you may, I think you probably have all taken away from this course that context is queen. You need to demonstrate that you understand the context where you're trying to implement. So what's the setting readiness? What's the capacity for change? Do you have any preliminary data that you can include in your preliminary study section that helps give information on that organizational culture? And you need to make the case that you're not just picking well-resourced sites. Because remember that point I made earlier about not creating or reifying existing inequities? If you only pick highly resourced sites, you then may be implementing a thing unevenly and not making it available to everyone. And it's helpful to have letters from people in the outer setting to suggest that what you're doing and the inner setting is aligned with the constituent priorities and what is happening within that context. With regard to implementation strategies and process, this is really important, right? The thing is something we want to describe, but not in the detail that we're describing the implementation strategies and process. And this is something I see when people are writing implementation science grants for the first or second time. There's a lot more emphasis placed on the thing than the strategies, but often we're testing the strategies, right? And so you need to be really detailed in how you talk about your implementation strategies. And actually, you can use a table that describes like where it comes from in the ERIC taxonomy and what the theoretical justification is. And you can even use some of the reporting guidelines to help you really clarify what the strategy is, especially if you're using one that might not be well known to reviewers. I've already said this, but we've really moved into a phase where there's an expectation growing that we test strategies in order to have a more mechanistic understanding of how they're working, not just do they work, but how do they work? And we're starting to see a lot of these large scale comparative effectiveness studies testing strategies head to head. So not just a strategy compared to implementation as usual. Based on some of the earlier data I showed you from the studies that have been funded, I do think there's an expectation that multi-level implementation strategies be used, and if not, a really strong justification for why. I've already briefly noted the importance of a strong transdisciplinary team, but you do want to really be thoughtful about your team experience when you're putting together a D&I grant. So does your team have the expertise to complete the proposed study? I've never put in a D&I grant without a mixed methods or qualitative methodologist, because that's such a critical part of the work that we do. If you're an early career person, think about how you can partner with senior investigators to help you be optimally successful, and then detail the strengths of your research environment, which here at Northwestern is really easy to do with CDIS and NewCats. It's really, a compelling case for why this is the right environment to be doing this type of research in. The next ingredient is related to measurement and analysis. It's important for you to specify your measurement plan for each construct and use that model that is guiding the approach to map the measurement and analysis on. And you want to be really explicit about your unit of analysis. Because you might be looking at a clinician level or a patient level or an organizational level variable. And then often when we're looking at mediation and a more mechanistic understanding of our strategies, we're going to be doing multi-level modeling, and it gets really complicated. And so you want to make sure that you've really captured the complexities associated with the measurement mixed methods approach that you might be taking. And I think this is the final ingredient before I wrap us up. Make sure your application reflects the policy and funding context. So if you're trying to study implementation strategies that could never be carried out large scale then that is more of like an efficacy implementation study. And I wouldn't recommend it. I think it's much more important for us to be deploying strategies that are actually feasible to be deployed in practice so that we can advance and have impact, which is really the goal of the field. I know I said this before, but I wanted it to be on a slide deck. If it's going to SIHH, you have to make sure that you have that impact statement about how this is going to yield generalizable knowledge. So it might be a new approach to designing strategies or amplifying the constituent voice, or you might be able to talk about how this particular approach you're taking is also relevant to other sensitive programs that you're going to be deploying in an ICU setting. But it can't just be about implementing your thing. It has to be broader than that for this particular study section. This is just a comic that I saw Ross Brownson share many moons ago that still feels very relevant. Hopefully, I've unpacked the black box of successful proposals a little bit more for you today. I want to thank NewCats and CETAS for inviting me to give this presentation. And then there's some references and additional resources. And I just want to call out there's actually a repository of funded grants from UNC that's listed here. And then again, the UW page has a bunch of different papers, that many of which are on this slide that you can check out. So that's all I got. Hopefully I stayed within my allotted time, and I will turn it back over.
Thanks so much, Fernand, for giving us such a wonderful overview of NIH funding. And now I'm going to take just a minute or two to talk about opportunities locally that folks in the Northwestern community can tap into, especially for smaller pilots, projects, and preliminary studies that go into the preliminary study section of that larger grant. Next slide, please. So the main one that I want to talk about is the Clinical and Translational Science Pilot Program that is supported annually by NewCats. The RFA is released in January every year, so you have about 6 months to think about the next one and plan for it. And historically, these have been about $30,000 for less than a year's worth of time. They don't have a no-cost extension associated with them, so they do have to be small projects that can be feasibly completed within that time period. And that has to do with how NewCats funding kind of moves from year to year. Now, historically, there were 2 separate programs. There was Dissemination and Implementation Program and Clinical and Translational Research. And the D&I awards could support both doing the thing, so you do something in practice and you have a research finding, you want to move it into the community, or understanding how to disseminate and implement a thing, which is more of the research and science part of it. So starting this year, because of the way nationally NCATS is changing, the focus is going to be is a little different. And there's a single combined program now focused on translational science. So all projects that, all applications must have at least one aim that focuses on generalizable principles and mechanisms of how to translate research. So it's no longer enough to say, I have this great finding, I'm going to move it from bench to practice or move it from practice to community. You have to somehow state how that will contribute to generalizable knowledge around translation. Very similar to what Renata just said about the study section at NIH. And then you can do that translational science in the context of your D&I project, your clinical and translational research project, or a hybrid project. So, and we also instituted a new letter of intent review process. So anyways, this is something for you to think about coming in 2024. Think about the generalizable principles of your work, and one big opportunity for you there. Next slide, please. You will all get copies of these slides, and all of the links and the information are up to date as of this weekend, as much as I could find them. But the Alliance for Research in Chicagoland Communities is a great source of seed grants. They have a number of different options ranging from 6 months to 24 months and 2,500 to more than 25,000. I think their cycles for this year are complete, but that means you have plenty of time to plan for your next cycle or 2024 application. Similarly, Northwestern Primary Care Practice-Based Research Program, seed grants are also a good source of local funding for smaller and larger projects. There's RFA for 2023 is not yet announced, so there might still be opportunities in the fall, but I did not see anything on their website as of yet. Next slide, please. And one more back, please. And then there are a number of other smaller opportunities like the Dixon Translational Research Grants, the NM Clinical Innovation Awards. Shirley Ryan has their own set of implementation-related grants as well. And of course, many of the departments themselves will support implementation and dissemination-related work. For sake of time, I won't go into all of the details. And one thing that I completely left off here, and even though it is relevant to my own work, the Center for AIDS Research here at Northwestern has a lot of pilot grants in both nationally sponsored and internally sponsored within implementation research and HIV. So definitely check those out too. I'll send an updated slide set.
All right, great. So I will jump in. Thank you to both Renette and Dennis for the great lead-ins to this discussion. And one of the things I wanted to highlight then is acknowledging that you're getting towards the end of the reading course. We only have one session remaining. And so I wanted to highlight some resources at Northwestern for you to continue your training. And that can be related to a preparation of grants, but also broadly in training and education. And so many of you may be familiar with this already, but I wanted to highlight our collaborative CDIS New Cats D&I consult service. So I am directing this service along with collaborators at CDIS and our broader network of implementation science experts at Northwestern. You'll see the QR code here on the right side of the slide. You can get to our website there and go to the training and support link, and you'll see a little box where you can actually request a D&I consultation. And then if you could go to the next slide for me. And I wanted to highlight the broad range of types of D&I consults that you can request. So the first is grant design, review, or key personnel support. So if you're going after an NIH grant, if you're going after a foundation grant, or even if you're writing one of the internal pilot project awards, you can come to us and submit a consultation request, and we can help support figuring out how to integrate implementation science into your grant. We can also match make you with key personnel. So as Renette noted, it's a team science approach. And so if you're looking for a collaborator for this work, a co-I, an MPI, and so forth, we can help you find those folks here at Northwestern who might be a good match. We can also offer mentorship and professional development services. So if you just want to learn more, maybe have some ongoing conversations about implementation research and science, we can talk to you about that as well. We also offer training and education, both one-on-one or also for your teams or broader groups of students and trainees that you work with. And that includes a repository of guest lectures. We also have a variety of other training resources that we can share. And then also at the end here, we are happy to collaborate on manuscripts, presentations, or other broad academic collaborations that are maybe outside of grant writing process or training and mentorship. So if you have a paper that you're writing up, for example, about a quality improvement project and you want to get someone with a D&I science lens to look at it, we're happy to provide that service as well. And then finally, we also work in collaboration with the Center for Community Health to provide support around community partnership building and engagement support. So you can come to us and submit a consultation request, and then we can also route you to our colleagues at CCH to help connect you to broader community engagement support services. And so what this typically looks like is you would go to that link that was on the last slide. You can submit a form. We'll ask you to give us a little bit of an overview of your request. If you're writing a grant, we typically ask for at least a brief draft aims page, so we have something to work with and understand what kind of project you're thinking about. And then our team, which often consists of myself, Miranda Olson, who's on the call, and Dr. Zubin Patel, we meet with you, we get a sense of your needs, we develop a personalized consultation plan for you. And then we also serve as matchmakers. So we'll send you resources, and then we'll connect you out with folks who might be a good fit, either for the content expertise needed for your particular project or broad implementation science science expertise. And so there's a lot of resources that we're able to offer. We invite you to submit requests as needs come up across any of these different categories. And I'll go to the next slide. And so I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what we've done so far. We formally launched this consult service in early February. And since then, we've completed 17 total consults. You'll see from the chart that most of them are pre-award support, but it really runs across a wide range of different grant options. So we've talked to folks about submitting R01s, K awards, T32s, as well as some of the small pilot projects and foundation funding. But we've also seen about 25% of our requests come from broad desire for mentorship, training and education, manuscript preparation. And many of these requests have resulted in successful grant submissions getting out the door, as well as ongoing planning and collaboration for future projects as well. So again, this is just an invitation to see that we have this service available to you if you'd like to continue learning about D&I as you move forward in your work and after the reading course has ended as well. And so I will stop there and make sure we have enough time for Q&A.
All right, thank you all so much for those wonderful presentations. I'm going to go back and look at this recording because I feel like this was the really valuable information that is difficult to find, but to have it all in one place is absolutely wonderful. I'd like to open up the room to questions now to see if anybody wanted to ask Renad or Kelly or Dennis anything about the information they presented today. I mean, I have a selfish personal question that I was going to ask like off camera, but I can ask it now. So one of the questions that I'm struggling with right now as a collaborator is how to write a grant for a study that is testing something that has evidence-based components, but the whole intervention or the program itself is not evidence-based yet, and how to present that to grant reviewers, because I want to be able to ask questions and plan for implementation and do kind of an early hybrid trial, but this is one of those programs where there genuinely is no existing evidence on this. And it feels like it will ring false if I try to present this as an implementation hybrid trial rather than an effectiveness trial, even though fundamentally I don't think we should be doing that kind of work for this kind of project. It should really have implementation components and effectiveness components. So I'd love to hear from our presenters a little bit about how you would present that.
Dennis, Kelly, do you want me to go first? Okay, happy to. So it's hard to speak in generalities. So without having like lots of specifics, and I would have a bunch of questions to ask you, what I would say broadly is that I think there is momentum to make the case that even when you're testing something that is not as a package evidence-based, but has components of evidence-based theoretical principles, that you can incorporate an implementation lens, and that perhaps you can just go right to testing it in the context in which it was meant to be delivered. And I'm just going to pop a paper in the chat, and it's a paper that I collaborated on. I know it, so that's why it's in my head, but there's many other people who have made this argument. So it's not just our group making that argument, that we cannot afford to wait until the very end. And it's what causes us to result in the voltage drop. So I think you could really turn that into an innovation and say that you're going to include an aim that, you know, explores this. But again, without knowing more concrete details, that's just a general suggestion, but I'd be happy to chat with you if that's helpful.
Thanks for that wonderful information.
I'm going to follow up with a question also to Renat about this, since you've probably served on the sub-study section. So kind of what Sarah was asking is about like almost an efficacy implementation hybrid. Have you seen those come through, and what is the general reaction to that?
I wouldn't send that to SIHH because they really want to be later on in the, now, have I seen things like that get reviewed? So I've been ad hoc, and I have to speak in generalities also because we are under, confidential, et cetera, when we do this reviewing work. But generally, I think that the committee is meant for type 2s and 3s. So when you're doing this kind of 0.5 hybrid, that might be like really more efficacy, but intent within the context in which it'll be delivered. So it's really looking also like an effectiveness study. I would send that to an RFA or to a program announcement within the kind of clinical area that you're doing the work within, because I think that SIHH would be expecting to see a bolus of evidence for your thing.
Any other questions from anyone else?
I'll jump in
yeah.
with one. So I'm curious, outside of NCI and SIHH, which clearly are setting a high bar, how much of an appetite, or maybe the better word is like tolerance, so that has kind of a negative connotation, is there for the implementation science frameworks? So for example, if I'm applying to an institute that, and I'm applying for a study that is not an implementation science study, but is using components of implementation science, how much or kind of what's the climate for framing the work with implementation science?
I can start. I think you need to know your audience. So that's the most important thing. And so just SIHH kind of sits across the institutes, and you'll have reviewers that sit within there that come from all different kinds of disease areas. And so it's important when you write for SIHH that you write in such a way that anyone can understand the kind of clinical component of it, because you might have somebody like me as a psychologist reviewing like, something related to cardiovascular disease. Within NIH writ large, I would say that they have done a really good job of infusing principles of implementation science across. So I wouldn't really be concerned about using implementation science terminology or concepts as long as you cite them. However, I always recommend that you talk to the program officer for a particular RFA because they know who they're going to invite to review. And I have had, and this was a long time ago now, that was probably like 5 or 7 years ago, a PO say, do a hybrid trial, but don't call it a hybrid trial, because that is not going to be understandable for the people that I'm going to be able to get to review this. Outside of NIH, I've tried to submit foundation grants where I have used a lot of implementation terminology, and that has not gone well for me. And so I think it's really important that you know your audience, that you talk to the program officer, and you can still use implementation science concepts and principles and methods without kind of calling out and using the terminology that is a little bit jargony to people who are not from our field.
I can speak a little from my experience in the HIV world, because HIV grants go to different study sections. It's very weird, and including the implementation ones. And so our implementation science HIV grants go in with the same effectiveness and even not quite some basic science, but and so writing for those audiences a couple of years ago, before this massive boom in implementation science in HIV, was very different than it is now. Back then, definitely got the advice of like, pick one framework, like use more, but in your grant, only really talk about one, or be very specific about justification, about this is for outcomes and why you need a different one for determinants. Nowadays, because there's been such an influx, I think people are more readily accepting of multiple theories, models, and frameworks. But you still, in the HRV world, you'll get reviewers who are not implementation scientists or not even that far down the translational spectrum. So writing for a generalist audience in a different way. I find the implementation research logic model or something similar to it is very helpful to get a lot of information in to a small section on in your pages.
Any other questions? How is the IRB process for DNI research? Can we request an exemption? Who wants to answer that? Yeah, yeah, Renaud wrote, that's a separate session, which I would generally agree. I was going to say it depends on who your reviewer is and which IRB you're going to and how you frame the application when you submit it. But I think that there are certain things you can do to anticipate and try to make the process a little bit smoother. But that is something that I think we're talking about at large. And maybe, I don't know if Renaud or Kelly or Dennis can add to this, but I do think that because we recognize implementation science is growing at Northwestern, we're trying to find ways to help bridge the IRB and implementation science gap, so to speak, to make sure that when we start submitting applications for IMPSI work, the IRB kind of understands what we're talking about and that we're able to kind of communicate and be on the same page.
Yeah, I was going to just reiterate that point. I think a lot of us have had ongoing conversations with the IRB about what our work looks like and how it's a little bit different or a lot different from more traditional efficacy or effectiveness trials that they're used to seeing come through the IRB. I think the best thing to do often is if you can get somebody on the phone or on Zoom to have a conversation, describe what you're planning to do. Because I have had studies where they say, you know, that's not really human subjects because you're just doing interviews with folks who are clinicians at a community mental health agency. But then I've had situations where it does fall into the category of human subjects because of different parameters of the proposal that I'm submitting to the IRB. So if you can have that conversation, have them understand what you're hoping to do, they can give you a more clear answer about whether it would be exempt or not.
And depending on how you design your study or talk about the design of your study, if you are kind of there's a slight difference between if you are going in and like changing something in the system for the purpose of your study, or if you're if that's happening in the clinical context regardless, and you just happen to be in there observing the process as it's happening, that is a big difference for the IRB. So to what Kelly was saying, I've had the IRB coordinator come back and say, nope, that's quality improvement. Nope, that's observations of processes. And I'm actually struggling in the other direction, trying to convince the NIH that they will take my exempt IRB determination as is enough.
Any other questions? I feel like I need a gavel to be like going once, going twice. All right, so I do want to finish out and just thank all of our speakers again today for these wonderful presentations. And I wanted to also remind everybody that next week is our final session and we do not have any assigned I'm sorry, I see Dennis waving his hand. You're right, it's not next week, it's the 26th, I believe, 6/26. We had to skip because of a scheduling problem. And that final session is really going to be whatever you all want it to be. So we would love to hear from you about topics you'd like to hear us discuss more or bring questions, or honestly, if you could tell us your questions beforehand so we can try and make it seem a little bit more structured. We would love to get those topics and those suggestions from you. So feel free to leave us any comments in the chat about things you'd like for us to be ready to discuss next time. And we're just gonna kind of use that session to discuss everything that's happened in the course and how it might apply to your work, and answer any other questions people may have. So feel free to ask those questions. You're also welcome to unmute and ask those questions if you'd like. Boy, there's so many chats. Okay. All right, well, if you haven't already sent, if you do have any questions or comments, but you don't want to share them today, you can also send them to cdis@northwestern.edu, and we will come ready to speak about whatever folks want to speak about at our next session. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the month.
Thank you.